The lunar soil felt different underfoot, even through the thick tread of my boots. There was no give, no moisture, just fine powder and compacted rock that clung stubbornly to every surface. I found that even the weight of my exosuit couldn't fully convince my body that I wasn't about to drift off like dust into the void above. The earth hovered in the distance, a dim blue marble, a familiar reminder turned strangely insignificant out here. Maybe that was what I'd come for. I adjusted the comms frequency in my helmet, tuning out the general chatter. "Dr. Grayson, commencing site survey," I said, my voice a bit hoarse in my ears. It wasn't a necessity. Protocol stated that routine surveys didn't require verbal reporting, but it felt like a tiny reassurance, something grounding against the yawning silence. "Copy that, Dr. Grayson," came the static-laced response from base camp. "Keep us posted." I moved toward the excavation site, where our drones had been methodically boring into the rock over the past week. The goal was to clear enough of the bedrock to support the foundation of the first permanent lunar habitat. It was historic, groundbreaking in every sense, and still, there was a sense of vacancy within me that refused to fill. Back on Earth, they were all watching with bright eyes, full of hope and pride, envisioning a new era for humanity. But for me, it was just a project, a temporary diversion from memories I preferred to leave buried. The others were spread out in pairs, heads down, focused on the endless tedium of site prep. Above us, the transport shuttles and construction pods drifted, waiting like patient mechanical birds. I made my way to the edge of the dig, watching as the drone arms scraped away another layer of soil. It was then that a strange shimmer caught my eye, a glint beneath the dust, different from the usual blend of rock and mineral deposits. I waved a hand to one of the nearby crew members, a geologist named Lewis. "Got something here." Lewis jogged over, her curiosity unmistakable. "Looks like metal? Crystal?" she muttered, squinting. "Doesn't look natural," I said, watching as the dust settled. There, beneath the layers of lunar soil, was a structure, like glass, but it radiated a faint inner light, an energy I could almost feel vibrating through my gloves. It looked ancient, older than anything we'd ever found on the moon, and entirely alien. We reported the find to base camp, and within an hour, half the team had gathered around. Even the veterans, usually unshakable, were captivated by it. After some preliminary analysis, the decision was made. We were going to dig further to explore. This wasn't in the mission plan, but there was no way we could ignore it. Alien structures simply didn't exist, at least not here, not on our moon. We worked in shifts, clearing soil, expanding the excavation site until we exposed a full wall of the structure. It was massive, at least 30 meters wide, stretching beyond the boundaries we'd initially marked. The translucent surface glimmered under our lights, giving off occasional flashes that seemed to ripple along its length like faint electrical currents. Some of the team speculated it was a form of glass, some thought it was metal, but I couldn't escape the feeling that it was neither, that it was something we had no language to describe. After 3 days, we'd cleared enough to create an entry point. I was assigned to the first exploration team, along with Lewis and 2 others. As I stepped into the breach, a prickling sensation ran up my spine, like stepping into the belly of something alive, something that was watching us. The interior was dim, illuminated only by a pale blue light emanating from the walls. There was no discernible source, yet the light persisted, seeming to follow us as we advanced. "Anything?" Lewis asked, her voice hushed, though we both knew there was no need for whispering in a sealed helmet. "Just this." I ran my gloved hand along the surface. It was cool, almost soft to the touch despite its hardness. An odd flicker of color shifted beneath my fingers, and I could have sworn I heard an unintelligible murmur. I quickly pulled my hand back. We moved deeper into the structure, carefully mapping the layout as we went. The walls seemed to curve in organic, sinuous ways, as if the place had grown rather than been built. Strange carvings, or maybe etchings, lined the walls, abstract patterns that shifted under our lights as though trying to elude clear definition. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find it gone when I looked directly. "What do you make of it?" Lewis asked, sounding more nervous than curious this time. I shook my head. "I don't know, but this is not what I expected." In truth, I was both fascinated and unsettled. I'd come to the moon to get away from human messes, to lose myself in hard, cold labor. But this structure, with its strange patterns and almost living walls, was anything but cold. As we mapped deeper sections, our lights suddenly flickered, and for a split second, everything went black. Just as the light returned, I saw a figure, blurred, half-transparent, standing in the hallway ahead. A man, it seemed, wearing a style of clothing I hadn't seen in decades. His mouth moved, but no sound came through, and then in a blink, he was gone. I shook my head, writing it off as a trick of the light or stress. But the sensation lingered, a chill settling into my bones. I felt observed. It was an irrational thought. The suit's systems would have picked up any actual life forms, but it felt as if something was here with us, that we weren't alone. Over the next few hours, more of the team reported similar encounters, figures that appeared and vanished, indistinct voices that seemed to echo in our ears even though we were entirely sealed off in our suits. We told ourselves it was our minds adjusting to the alien environment, that it was a shared hallucination, a stress reaction. But the more I heard those whispers, the more I started to feel something foreign settling into my thoughts. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. I could barely admit it to myself, but somehow those flashes weren't random hallucinations. They were memories, moments of pain and despair that would flash through my mind like brief, violent storms. I felt emotions I couldn't place, regrets that didn't belong to me, and faces always shifting that I couldn't quite remember after they faded. Days passed, and my visits to the alien structure became a routine mix of duty and morbid curiosity. I didn't understand why I kept going back, why I felt drawn to its dark corridors. Each visit left me more disturbed, more unsettled, but I couldn't resist. Something within this place was calling to me, as if I was searching for something only it could reveal. My nights, or the lunar equivalent of them, were plagued by dreams. I would see faces, hear fragments of voices calling out to me, begging for something I couldn't give them. When I'd wake, sweating and disoriented, those faces would still linger, their expressions twisted with unresolved pain. I began to dread sleep, to fear the brief moments of rest when those foreign memories would break through. In the moments between wakefulness and sleep, a voice, a woman's voice, would echo just on the edge of my perception. I never got to say goodbye, she would say, her tone full of anguish, of desperation. Each time it felt like an invasion, as though something was pressing against my mind, trying to worm its way inside. I tried to rationalize it. I reminded myself of my background in consciousness mapping, of how memories could be synthesized and implanted, of how hallucinations weren't uncommon in high-stress environments. But deep down, I knew these weren't random flashes. They were memories that didn't belong to me, alive with something dark and desperate. One night, as I lay awake, my mind wandering despite myself, I began to wonder, was this guilt finally coming back to haunt me? Memories of the failed experiment, of the subjects whose lives were ruined by my mistakes, flooded back. Maybe this alien place was nothing but a mirror reflecting my own unresolved regrets. But even as I thought this, a voice in my mind rebelled. "No," it insisted. "These are not your regrets. This is not your guilt." But whose was it then? It was a week after the first strange sighting that I reached a breaking point. I was back in the alien structure again, this time alone, conducting a final survey before we set up new analysis equipment. I'd been trying to focus, running my gloved hand over the patterns on the walls, when the whispering began again. This time, it was clearer, a chaotic chorus of voices, all overlapping, some pleading, some screaming, others whispering incoherently. It was overwhelming, like a swarm pressing in, until I felt I was suffocating inside my suit. "Stop it!" I whispered, though I didn't know who I was speaking to. The voices quieted, but not entirely. One voice emerged from the chorus, low and mournful. It was a man, his tone full of regret, his words fragmented. I didn't get to. I had so much left." I stumbled back, my pulse racing. I could feel his sorrow, a grief that felt as real as my own heartbeat. "Dr. Grayson, you all right?" Lewis's voice crackled over the comms, startling me. Yeah, I'm fine," I said, struggling to regain control. But as I looked around the dim corridor, I felt it again. A presence. I tore myself away, stumbling back through the tunnel, my only thought to escape. But as I neared the exit, a chilling realization settled into my mind. I had felt it, something beyond the memories, beyond the walls, and it wanted me. The pale glow of the alien structure lingered in my vision long after I returned to the habitat. I forced myself to look away as I approached the docking hatch, blinking against the floodlights that swept over me. Lewis and the others had already gone inside, retreating to their own thoughts. But I hesitated at the entrance, casting one last glance over my shoulder. It was impossible to shake the feeling of being watched, as if something unseen clung to me, pressing its presence against my mind like an unwelcome guest. I shook off the thought and stepped into the airlock, mentally preparing to debrief with the team. 3 days later, we were back at the site, this time equipped with specialized mapping drones and scanning gear meant to penetrate the structure's denser sections. The team, myself included, had pushed for this. Despite the growing unease, curiosity was mounting. We couldn't let it rest. Whatever this place was, it felt like something unprecedented. We weren't going to let it slip away unexplored. As the drones buzzed ahead, sending back fractured feeds, Lewis and I took the lead, moving deeper into the structure than before. My eyes played tricks on me, teasing shapes in the dimness, shadows that seemed to hover at the edges of my sight. "This whole place is a labyrinth," Lewis murmured. "Every time I think I understand its layout, it shifts. The walls, the paths, they're almost morphing." It wasn't just Lewis's imagination. The tunnels seemed to fold in on themselves, shapes along the walls aligning in new, disorienting patterns. I pushed on even as the patterns carved into the walls became more chaotic, more complex, their geometry alien and unsettling. They seemed to shimmer faintly beneath my fingers, shifting in response to our touch. A ripple moved through the air, distorting my vision like a heat wave. Shadows appeared on the walls, faint, ghostly silhouettes that came in and out of focus. Figures began to take shape, fragmented and ethereal. Some standing close as though watching us, others drifting past like reflections caught in a passing window. Some just stared. Others reached out with open mouths, whispering words too faint to understand, their lips forming broken syllables before dissolving into the wall. It lasted only seconds, but it left my chest tight and my pulse racing. "Did you hear that?" Lewis's voice shook. I nodded, unable to find my voice. Those sounds, those voices, they carried weight, meaning. And as they faded, a pressure settled into my mind, like something foreign brushing against my consciousness. Back at the habitat, I spent every spare moment combing through the recorded footage, replaying those sounds and dissecting the layers of audio we'd captured. The first few passes revealed little more than static and distortion. But as I isolated the deeper frequencies, something emerged, a clear, distinct pattern that repeated. The fragments of language sounded almost human, but twisted, distant, layered with emotion so raw it was unsettling to listen to. Regret, pain, a torrent of despair threaded through each word, each phrase. These weren't random recordings, and they weren't ambient sounds. They were voices, thousands of them, fragmented memories somehow contained within this place. The more I listened, the more certain I became that this wasn't simply a repository of alien knowledge. No, it was something more sinister. A collection of memories, emotions, experiences, Lives, perhaps, trapped within these walls. Some ancient intelligence had gathered these fragments. But why? And how? The questions plagued me, their weight growing heavier. As the realizations sank in, the edges of my vision blurred, and suddenly, I wasn't in the habitat. I was back inside the structure, the walls throbbing in rhythm with my heartbeat, their light dimming and intensifying like breaths drawn in pain. I heard a voice, distinct and close. "I never had the chance. I couldn't. Please." I gasped, clutching at the sides of my head. The voice wasn't in my ears but inside my mind, a sensation that felt invasive, as if something had seeped through the cracks in my psyche. The following days blurred together, and with them, so did my thoughts. More and more, I found myself lost in visions, snippets of lives I'd never lived, memories of places I'd never seen. They came to me without warning, flashing through my mind like broken scenes from someone else's story. At night, I'd lie in my bunk, feeling the darkness press in, and then, in the space between wakefulness and sleep, I'd slip. I'd see a family huddled together in the rain, hear their voices as if they were my own. Or I'd feel the sharp stab of heartbreak, a grief so intense it left me struggling to breathe. Faces I didn't recognize floated in the darkness, pleading, accusing, their voices echoing with pain. "Who are you?" I would ask in a whisper. She never came back. She left me here. The voice was close, layered with a bitterness that twisted like a knife in my mind. Alone. I waited. I always waited. I bolted upright, my heart racing. The voice didn't fade this time. It lingered, threading through my thoughts, becoming clearer. In the days that followed, I struggled to function, to focus. I'd lose track of time, of conversations, slipping into vivid memories that felt as real as any moment of my own life. I'd catch glimpses of my reflection in polished surfaces, my helmet visor, the glass panel of a supply case, and find unfamiliar faces staring back. A woman, young and sad, her eyes rimmed with red as she mouthed words I couldn't understand. A man, older, his expression weary, haunted. Each time they looked through me as though I were a stranger, as if they were trapped and waiting for me to notice them. And each time the echoes of their lives lingered in my mind like a stain, sinking into my consciousness, blurring the boundaries of who I was. By the second week, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being pulled into something vast and inescapable. The more I fought to hold on to my memories, my thoughts, the stronger the intrusions became. They were no longer random flashes. They were taking root, like vines creeping through the cracks of a wall. One morning, as I prepared for yet another survey, I stared at my reflection in the mirror and felt a shudder run down my spine. For a moment, my face blurred, as though overlaid with another image, a face that wasn't mine, twisted with an expression of agony I couldn't remember ever feeling. I reached out to touch my own face, half expecting it to shift under my fingers to become someone else. I squeezed my eyes shut, breathing slowly, forcing myself to focus on something real, something solid. The voice that had haunted me last night returned, murmuring close to my ear. "Help me. Please, don't leave me here." I opened my eyes and the reflection was gone, but the voice remained, threaded through my thoughts as if it were a part of me. I didn't know who I was anymore. These memories, the faces, the voices, they were more real to me now than my own life, my own past. And with each day, my own memories felt thinner, slipping further from reach. By the time I returned to the alien structure, I could feel the tug like a physical force, drawing me deeper. I was no longer sure if I was searching for answers or simply giving in to the compulsion that had rooted itself in my mind. Around me, the walls seemed to ripple in response, and in the dim blue light, shadows moved, coalescing into shapes, faces, bodies, figures coming in and out of focus. They surrounded me, their mouths forming words that hung in the air like smoke. It was too much. I couldn't go on. I lost everything. The voices bounced around me, each one soaked in sorrow, regret, and a longing so intense it felt like it might tear me apart. I stumbled back, my head pounding, and pressed my hands to my ears, but the voices wouldn't stop. The day after my last encounter in the alien structure, we received word from Earth Command that a specialist would be arriving to assist us. Dr. Ethan Marwick, a neuroscientist and expert in consciousness studies, was sent from Earth with specialized equipment to analyze whatever we were dealing with. His arrival brought mixed feelings. Part of me hoped he'd be able to shed light on what we'd discovered, but I was wary of seeing our experiences reduced to data points and readings. Marwick arrived early in the morning, unassuming in stature but sharp in expression. He took in the lunar base, then looked at me with the cool curiosity of a man unbothered by what he might find. "Dr. Grayson," he said as we shook hands, "I hear you've been encountering some unusual phenomena here." I nodded, keeping my response neutral. "You could say that." Marwick's response was quick and focused, like he had already made up his mind. "Let's get to work. I have the equipment prepped for a full analysis. I'd like to see this structure firsthand." Lewis, who had become more silent and tense, seemed relieved by Marwick's confidence, as if his presence alone would clarify what we couldn't. After a brief rundown of his technology, a neural scanner he called the synaptic resonance analyzer, designed to detect and isolate active conscious patterns, we suited up for another descent. Marwick led the way, his equipment humming as it scanned the walls around us. I found myself acutely aware of each sound and shadow in the structure's corridors, half expecting faces to emerge from the walls. Lewis stuck close, her silence heavier than usual. Marwick adjusted his device, directing the scanner toward one of the glowing walls. "The patterns here," he muttered, watching the monitor. "It's as though they were built from neural pathways." I exchanged a glance with Lewis. "Neural pathways? What do you mean?" "These readings," Marwick continued, pointing to the screen, "show activity levels consistent with human brain patterns. In fact, they're almost identical." Marwick activated a deeper layer of the scan, isolating certain signals, and as he worked, I could hear voices overlapping in the quiet. They were fractured and distant, but enough to suggest we were hearing fragments of memories. I'd heard them before, but now, watching Marwick's device pull them apart, the reality was sinking in. "We're not dealing with alien machinery," I said, the words coming slowly. "This place is human." Marwick barely looked up. "From what I can tell, yes. This is a repository for human memory patterns." He zoomed in on a specific frequency range where one voice began to emerge distinctly. A woman, her tone resigned. "I wanted to make things right, but it was too late." The voice cut off, and then another took its place. A man's this time, strained with regret. "I was supposed to be there, but I failed them." Each voice carried a piece of a life, a moment of something left incomplete. Marwick's calm demeanor finally cracked, just slightly, as he began putting it together. "These are death memories," he said slowly. "Memories of people who didn't find closure. This isn't just a record. These are remnants of human consciousness stored somehow." As Marwick isolated more signals, his face became tenser. He scrolled through the readouts, and a strange intensity crossed his features. "This structure wasn't just built to capture memory patterns," he said, almost to himself. "There's an organizing system here, a kind of sorting mechanism." "A sorting mechanism for what?" Lewis asked. Marwick turned to us, his expression grim. "It's an archive of human deaths, and not just any deaths. Those marked by unfinished business, regret, pain. Lives that ended with unresolved emotions. The memories I'd been experiencing, the visions of loss and failure, were from people who had died without finding peace. And somehow their consciousness had been trapped here, encoded within this structure. They're aware of themselves," I said, realizing it as I spoke. "They're not just memories. They're alive, sentient. Each of them carries a piece of the person they belong to." Marwick's face hardened. "It would appear so, and it's likely they've been here for centuries, maybe longer. Whoever built this, an alien civilization, I'd guess, wanted to study humanity's concept of death. They must have underestimated the complexity of human consciousness and emotion. As he spoke, I felt a creeping horror settle in. This place wasn't a sanctuary or a museum. It was a prison, one where the dead were conscious, aware of their regrets, and trapped in an endless cycle of longing for what they'd left undone. The revelation left us silent. The voices became clearer, as though sensing that we'd uncovered their secret. They pleaded, incomplete phrases reaching out, filled with an urgency that sent a chill through me. "We can't leave them here," Lewis said, her voice breaking. "There has to be a way to release them." Marwick hesitated. "If we interfere, we risk getting pulled in ourselves. This structure is designed to capture and hold conscious energy. If we tamper with it, we may end up joining them." "But what kind of choice is that?" Lewis asked, frustration edging into her tone. "To leave them trapped like this." I felt a pull to stay, to try, but the reality was harsh. We didn't understand this technology fully, and every instinct told me that leaving was our only real option. I looked at Marwick, whose face had hardened with reluctant resolve. "We have to leave," he said. "We'll bring the data back to Earth, share what we know. Maybe someday someone can find a way to help them." Lewis looked at me, clearly torn, but after a tense moment, she nodded, defeated. I could see the regret in her eyes, the anger at leaving without answers. But even she knew that staying here any longer would be too dangerous. As we turned to leave, the voices became louder, filling the corridors. They were angry now, desperate, pleading for release. It took all my strength to keep walking, to ignore the haunting pull that tried to drag me back. Back on Earth, we were quickly escorted into a secure debriefing. In a plain, windowless room, surrounded by military officers, government officials, and scientists, we recounted what we'd found. Marwick presented his findings, explaining the structure's purpose as an archive of unresolved human deaths. The officials listened with fascination and disbelief. Some dismissed it as an elaborate psychological phenomenon, while others saw potential in studying the archive further. There was talk of securing the site, perhaps using it for research. The ethical implications barely seemed to matter. One official asked if there was any way to harness the archive's power for human use, perhaps as a means of prolonging consciousness after death. The question made my stomach turn, but I didn't respond. I could see Marwick's own discomfort in his silence, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the room. When asked directly about the experience, I kept my response short. These are real people, real memories. It's not just data, it's conscious, aware, and it feels like suffering. I didn't elaborate. I knew that no matter what I said, they'd have to see it for themselves to understand. As we left the debriefing, Lewis walked alongside me. She hadn't spoken much since our return, and I knew that leaving the archive behind weighed on her as much as it did on me. Back in my quarters, I took a moment to stare out at the night sky, knowing that somewhere beyond it, on the surface of the moon, those voices still lingered, suspended in their prison. I couldn't change what we'd left behind, couldn't unburden the people trapped in that place. Maybe no one ever could. But as I stood there, I realized that the archive was a stark reminder. Lives filled with unfinished business could linger long after they were supposed to end. It was a strange kind of comfort, knowing that even in death, there was a persistence to memory and emotion.